Hugh, what was your kind of emotional response to the film? Because you know the science backwards, but what about the emotional side?
Yeah, I suppose it was interesting because I was trying to analyse that as I was watching it, because I was furious, of course. And I suppose I was particularly furious at the fact there was still a need for Franny to make the film. I wasn't just angry with the content of the film, because I think one should rightly be so. It does stir the emotions. But I was so furious that we've reached this stage when the science has been absolutely bomb-proof for decades, and that's been certainly building for a decade. And yet if you look, I was looking at the graphs yesterday for our global CO2 emissions, Kyoto's made not a dent in that trajectory at all. Nothing has changed at all. And yet we're now facing a situation where we might have a 25% chance of tipping over into unstoppable climate change if we continue with the current rates of emissions until 2025, when we won't be able to release a single further atom of carbon dioxide. So I'm always slightly concerned by these trajectories, 80% reductions by, because as a scientist, of course, it depends on the path you take to get there. And what we now understand is we need a very, very steep shelving down.
And do you believe in your heart that that's doable, 80% reduction by 2050? I mean, does it make you depressed? Does it make you, you said angry, does it inspire you to action? What's the response?
Well, it makes me angry, it makes me depressed, but it does inspire me a little too, because there are times in very few generations, actually, I suppose that we've had world wars in the previous generations, where people have had to step up to the plate to do drastic things, to make substantial sacrifices for the sake of others, and it falls on our watch now for us to take those similar sorts of actions, and it is down to us. We're getting this message very clearly, and I dare say Franny is as well, that politicians very often now want to make the change, but they have to have us demanding it. We hear this regularly, and I know you've had this message too from politicians saying, please start making noise. It's not being a troublemaker, it's being helpful. And we've got to clamour. They're expecting a screaming match to come out of the health profession to support this sort of change. And we've all got to do that.
David, I know that environmental issues have plummeted on the national agenda, if you like, on the people's main concerns. It's now something like 2%, as opposed to, 70% a couple of years ago. And the economy is the big issue. And people might say, listening or watching this film, this webcast, why should the NHS worry about climate change when we face, problems like budget cuts and swine flu and performance targets? And why is this the big priority?
Well, because it's such a catastrophe about to hit us, that if we are caring for our patients, then this is probably the most important thing we could be doing in being a leader, both as clinicians, Department of Health, managers and so on, about instigating an element of anxiety and fear, because in a way we've been far too complacent. So I think that's a key part. And it's interesting as a doctor that many of us, including myself until fairly recently to be frank, have nearly got into this, and yet we have, whether we like it or not, a certain leadership role which we need to exhibit in other ways, because actually this will help our patients both as individuals but also as populations. And when you think, I used to work in an area of low income, that climate change even in the shorter term is going to hit them disproportionately harder and make health inequalities worse. So I think we have a huge leadership role here, which probably things like this film are needed to get our backsides going, really.
And would you say we've reached a point at which this becomes one of the duties of a doctor? I mean, it's always difficult. At what point does it stop being political, and what point does it actually become a core duty of a doctor to warn people about this impending threat, catastrophe? Well,
I think it's a duty of anybody who's got I suppose, I don't want to make it sound too grand, a leadership role. But it certainly hasn't impacted on my medical profession, on my colleagues, that this is one of their roles at all. And I think it's going to be, hopefully, this could be helping a tipping point like for everybody else. But it hasn't really been perceived. One of the interesting things, if you're a general practitioner, you have a population responsibility as well as the person in front of you, the patient in front of you. And again, general practice maybe hasn't done as much about looking at its population needs as it has on the individual needs. And so general practice and others in the community have an even bigger, I think, leadership role, being part of embedded in a community to do something about it. But it hasn't really featured in very high up in the medical world until this moment, apart from exceptional people like Hugh.
And Angela, your job as a public health consultant is that population agenda. Do you get the sense that we have to, how do we balance up the need to mitigate, the need to adapt? You know, that balance between, is it too late, are we fiddling while Rome burns, or are there things we can both do to adapt and mitigate, if you see what I mean? Well, how do you explain that to people?
Well, I feel really encouraged that the NHS has brought the rights for age of stupid. I think the NHS workforce is 1 in 50 of the population. We share an ethos, which is that we often see problems ahead of others and we just start doing it because we believe it's the right thing to do. In my NHS organisation, I got very frustrated at how little it was possible to do. So I put my energies into my family life and starting a local sustainability group. And then what happened was we created an edge within the organisation where all the directors of public health across our patch felt very concerned about the proposals for airport expansion in Bristol. And they took it to their boards and said, we think our organisations should, on public health grounds, oppose airport expansion. That created a huge conflict. So the directors of public health opposed airport expansion on home-headed note paper, but we then had a board seminar where a real Macquarie climate scientist came and gave a talk for our board. You could have heard a pin drop. And from that moment on, the board was totally signed up. And then what we did was we did a very simple survey for all staff saying, what do you feel about this issue? Because the top people thought that the rank and file wouldn't go with any changes. And what it showed was 78% of people responded, which is massive. 94% of those said they were very or fairly concerned. And they all said, why is our organisation dragging its feet? Mm. And then if we can show films like this is about survival. This isn't optional. And the recession is part of it. And if you want to see how money crunch, climate crunch and energy crunch all fit together, then watch something called the Crash Course, which just Google Crash Course. So I've huge hope that the NHS can make a big difference because we're also advocates in our local communities. Mm.